Protection Command isn't the taxi service. So he misused police resources for his own ends. But obviously...
Camilla was reportedly left furious after palace guards blocked her private guests. And on the surface, that sounds like one more awkward royal mishap. The kind of cold little incident that gets brushed off as a misunderstanding and buried under polite statements. But what makes this so revealing is that the real issue is not a guest list problem. It is not even about security in the narrow sense. It is about who truly has authority inside royal walls, who gets respected without question, and who still has to feel the edge of institutional power even after reaching the very top. Because when palace guards stop people connected to the Queen, you are no longer looking at a simple inconvenience. You are looking at the monarchy showing its instincts in real time. And that is why this landed harder than it looked. If you follow this channel, you already know that in royal life, the smallest moments often tell the biggest truths. So make sure you subscribe and stay with me, because this one opens a much bigger conversation than people think. Not just about Camilla, but about the atmosphere around her, the limits around her, and the difference between being publicly elevated and privately unquestioned. Because here is the thing. In ordinary life, if guests are invited to a private royal residence and then get stopped at the gate, it is embarrassing. In royal life, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes a signal about communication, control, rank, territory, and the invisible line between family privilege and institutional permission. And if Camilla really was angry, that reaction makes perfect sense, because what would sting is not only the inconvenience. What would sting is what it implied. It implied that even her circle, even her arrangements, even her personal space, could still be interrupted by a structure bigger than her. That is where this gets interesting. Camilla's story inside the monarchy has never been straightforward. She is now queen, yes, but her journey into that role was never natural, never easy, and never emotionally uncomplicated in the eyes of the public. She did not enter this institution as the fairy tale bride who symbolized innocence, renewal, or uncomplicated national affection. She entered it carrying history, controversy, resentment, and a long shadow that the palace spent years trying to manage. So every moment involving her still carries extra meaning. Every slight feels amplified. Every gesture of respect matters more. Every awkward incident becomes a test of whether she is truly settled at the center of the institution or still occupying a position that had to be carefully negotiated into place. That is why a scene like this resonates. Because if palace guards blocked private guests linked to Camilla, then people are immediately going to ask, was this just procedure, or was this atmosphere? Was it simple protocol, or was it something colder than that? Was it one team not properly informed, or was it a reminder that in royal households, real power is often exercised not with grand speeches, but with doors, lists, permissions, timing, and access? And that is exactly how royal tension usually works. Not in shouting matches in front of cameras, not in dramatic public showdowns, but in the quiet mechanics of who gets through and who gets told to wait, who receives instant cooperation and who runs into a wall, who is treated as central and who is treated as someone whose authority still needs checking. In a family like this, almost nothing stays small for long. Now, to understand why this would have felt so personal, you have to look at Camilla not only as the king's wife, but as a symbol inside a very old institution. Factually, she is the queen beside Charles. Symbolically, she represents something much more delicate, the monarchy's attempt to stabilize a once divisive figure and present her as accepted, settled, and legitimate. That image took years to build. Years of careful appearances, years of reduced visibility compared to flashier royals, years of emphasizing duty over glamour, and years of letting time do the work that public relations alone never could. Camilla's role was built through endurance, through patience, through sticking close to Charles and steadily becoming part of the furniture of monarchy rather than the disruption to it. But the problem with a role built that way is that it can still feel conditional. Not necessarily on paper, not in formal title, but emotionally, institutionally, symbolically. Because bloodline royals move through the system differently. They do. That may sound harsh, but it is true. There is a difference between being born into the chain of legitimacy and being attached to it through marriage. A queen consort or queen can stand beside the crown, support the crown, reinforce the crown, even shape the atmosphere around the crown, but the emotional grammar of monarchy still treats inherited centrality differently from acquired status. And that difference can sit quietly for months, even years, until some incident suddenly exposes it. Like a gate being closed, like guards saying no, like guests being stopped. That is when the atmosphere shifts. Because think about how this would feel from Camilla's side. This is someone who has spent decades adapting to the royal machine. Decades learning where to stand, what to say, when to appear, when to recede, how to support Charles without outshining him, how to project reliability without provoking old public wounds. She has done the work the palace needed from her. She has shown discipline. She has played the long game. So if her private guests were blocked in a setting that should have reflected her authority, of course the deeper insult would not be logistical. It would be emotional. It would raise a simple but painful question. After all this time, am I still not fully unquestioned here? And notice how quickly a moment like that stops being personal and starts becoming structural. Because palace guards are not free-floating characters in a family drama. They are extensions of order. They reflect protocol, chain of command, and risk management. So when they act in a way that embarrasses a senior royal, it suggests one of two uncomfortable things. Either communication around that royal was weak enough that her own arrangements were not carried through properly, which signals disorder, or the enforcement culture was strong enough to override her expectations, which signals limits. Neither option feels flattering. That is why incidents like this create such fascination around the royal family. The public sees a blocked guest and thinks drama, but what royal watchers hear underneath it is hierarchy. They hear the old question that never quite goes away. Who matters most when image drops and protocol takes over? Who gets deference automatically, and who still has to negotiate for it? Now, some people will say this is being overread, that security is security, rules are rules, and perhaps nobody meant anything by it. And yes, on one level, that is entirely possible. Royal residences are security-heavy spaces. Procedures exist for a reason. Lists can fail, staff can misread timings, new instructions can cross old ones. In any tightly controlled environment, these things happen. But here is the problem with that argument. In royal life, intent and impact are never the same thing. A slight does not need to be deliberate to be felt deeply. Embarrassment does not need a villain to become meaningful. And for a woman like Camilla, whose place has always been more politically sensitive than people admit, the impact matters. That is what made it sting. And it also touches something even more delicate, the difference between public rank and private comfort. Publicly, Camilla can appear beside the king, receive ceremonial honors, host, travel, and represent continuity. But private comfort inside the institution is another matter. Private comfort means being able to act without friction. It means your word moves things. It means your arrangements are not second-guessed in humiliating little ways. It means the machine has absorbed your authority so completely that problems are solved before they reach you. If that did not happen here, then what was exposed was not just a failed moment, it was vulnerability. And Camilla's royal identity has always been tied to vulnerability, whether the palace likes that or not. Not weakness. Vulnerability is different. She is not weak. In many ways, Camilla has survived pressures that would have broken a less durable public figure. She endured years of hostility. She waited while history was rewritten around her, and while public opinion moved slowly, stubbornly, unevenly. She became useful to the monarchy precisely because she could absorb discomfort and still keep functioning. That gave her a narrative role inside the family, the seasoned loyalist, the companion figure, the steady presence who helped Charles hold his course. She was never supposed to be the glittering future. She was the solid support beam. But support beams are rarely adored in the way crowns are. And that matters when tension appears. Because Charles and Camilla have always been a partnership shaped as much by endurance as by romance. Charles, factually the monarch, represents continuity, burden, and the old royal idea that duty outlives scandal if you simply keep going. Camilla, beside him, represents the monarchy's bet that familiarity can soften resistance and that service, can slowly overwrite controversy. Together, they embody a quieter, older, less theatrical version of royal legitimacy. Not youthful fairy tale legitimacy, not celebrity monarchy, something more stubborn than that. Which is exactly why an incident involving blocked private guests becomes so symbolically awkward. It cuts into the image of settled domestic command. It suggests that even in spaces that should feel socially hers, the machinery can still turn impersonal. And once that impression is out there, people start seeing broader fault lines. They start wondering whether Camilla's place is secure in ceremony, but less instinctively protected in culture. They start asking whether the royal household around Charles fully breathes in her authority, or merely accommodates it. That distinction is everything, because accommodation is not the same as belonging. And belonging is one of the most sensitive issues in this family. Look at the broader royal landscape, and you start to see why. The monarchy is always balancing bloodline against marriage, continuity against adaptation, symbolism against personality. William as heir is central because he is the future of the line. Catherine, as his wife, gains enormous weight because she stands beside the future itself, and because she has been publicly cast as the elegant bridge between tradition and modern image. Anne, as the tireless worker, carries another kind of respect, the respect reserved for someone whose usefulness is beyond argument. Even figures on the edges of the working family still get measured according to proximity to the line, usefulness to the brand, and emotional importance to the institution. Camilla fits into that ecosystem in a unique way. She is at the summit in title, but not in the same emotional category as an heir, not in the same birthright category as royal blood, and not in the same mythic category as the young future-facing figures the palace often uses to reassure the public. She is central, but in a complicated way, important, but differently, powerful, but not always effortlessly so. And that is why any sign of friction around her matters more than it would around someone else, because it feeds an old suspicion that her position, though formally secure, remains psychologically negotiated. That may sound subtle, but monarchy runs on subtleties. It always has. The crown is not only jewels and speeches, it is choreography, presence, acceptance, deference. It is the emotional management of rank. So when that management slips, even briefly, the incident can feel bigger than the event itself. Here is where the family dimension becomes impossible to ignore. The royal family is both a household and a machine, and those two realities do not always like each other. A family wants warmth, flexibility, private understanding. A machine wants order, caution, command flow, and enforceable boundaries. When private guests are blocked, those two worlds collide. Someone thinks in personal terms, they were invited, why are they waiting? Someone else thinks in institutional terms, the clearance is incomplete, the rules apply. In ordinary families, that tension is annoying. In royal families, it becomes symbolic warfare by accident. And Camilla, more than many, sits right at that uncomfortable junction, because she has spent years helping humanize Charles, soften rooms, create social ease, and make the monarchy feel less emotionally frozen. She is often seen as the one who understands atmosphere, the one who can lower the temperature, the one who brings a more grounded, lived-in energy to royal life. So if her own guests were met not with ease but with a barrier, then the scene almost writes its own irony. The person associated with smoothing the mood suddenly becomes the person publicly faced with institutional coldness. That is not just awkward, that is telling. And I think that is why the idea of Camilla being furious rings true emotionally, even if people debate the finer details. Fury in this kind of setting is not necessarily loud. It may not mean a scene. It may mean the kind of contained royal anger that is colder than shouting, the kind that comes from humiliation more than inconvenience, the kind that says, how did this happen on my watch, to my guests, in my space? Because in elite institutions, embarrassment is power-related. If you are embarrassed, it means control slipped. And control is precious in the monarchy, especially now. Because let's be honest, this is a period when the royal family is under constant pressure to project steadiness. The king's reign has had to define itself in a delicate climate. The institution is dealing with generational change, public scrutiny, health concerns, questions about relevance, and the constant media obsession with internal tension. That means every public impression counts. Stability matters. Smoothness matters. The feeling that the house is in order matters. So even a relatively contained incident can feel larger because it punctures that image. It creates the sense that behind the velvet and ritual, there are still internal frictions, misfires, and competing centers of control. And people notice, because audiences are not only drawn to scandal, they are drawn to contradiction. They are fascinated by the gap between the polished royal picture and the messy human reality underneath it. A blocked gate is that contradiction in miniature. The palace wants to look seamless. The incident says it is not. The palace wants hierarchy to appear graceful. The incident says hierarchy can still bruise. The palace wants relationships to seem settled. The incident says some things are only settled until pressure hits. That is the deeper story. And there is also something specifically revealing about guards being the ones at the center of it. Guards represent the literal edge of the institution. They are where symbolism becomes enforcement. Up to a point, everything in royal life is image, tradition, message. But at the gate, it becomes simple. You are either admitted or you are not. You are recognized or you are delayed. You are within the circle or waiting outside it. That makes moments at the gate intensely symbolic whether anyone intends them to be or not. Which means if Camilla's guests were blocked, then the message of the moment, fair or unfair, becomes brutally clear. Access is not assumed just because you feel close to the crown. And that is where old tensions around legitimacy quietly reappear. Not legitimacy in the legal sense, not title, not paperwork, emotional legitimacy, cultural legitimacy, the sense of being accepted so completely that the institution moves around you naturally. That kind of legitimacy cannot be granted in one announcement. It is built over time, and even then, it can remain fragile in the public imagination. Camilla knows that better than almost anyone, so incidents that touch that nerve are never going to feel neutral. Now add Charles to this picture, and the stakes become even more layered. Charles has always existed between private feeling and public formality. He is not a naturally effortless monarch in the theatrical sense. He is thoughtful, structured, often guarded, and deeply shaped by the institution he inherited. Camilla has long been framed as one of the few people who creates a sense of ease around him. So if something around her social world breaks down, it indirectly reflects on him too, on the household around him, on the command structure around the couple, on whether the inner circle is functioning in harmony or in fragments. And that is when it stops being a simple family moment. Because if the Queen's private arrangements cannot move smoothly, then what does that suggest about the wider palace atmosphere, about internal communication, about how different teams coordinate, about which voices carry automatic weight, and which ones still hit procedural resistance? These are the kinds of questions royal watchers immediately start asking, because once you follow monarchy long enough, you learn that systems reveal themselves through their mistakes. And perhaps most telling of all is how moments like this often leave no clean ending, even if it was resolved in minutes. Even if apologies were made, even if the guests were eventually let in and everyone moved on, the emotional residue remains. The atmosphere changes. People remember who was inconvenienced, who was embarrassed, who looked unsupported, and who seemed to have the final say in the moment that mattered. That residue matters in royal life, because relationships inside the institution are built on accumulation. Respect accumulates, resentment accumulates, confidence accumulates, so does doubt. One incident may not transform everything overnight, but it can sharpen feelings that were already there. It can remind someone of old insecurities. It can reinforce a sense of distance. It can make a person feel that no matter how high they rise, parts of the system still do not instinctively bend around them. For Camilla, that would be the real bruise. Not the blocked guests themselves, but the reminder of conditional ease. And that is why this story has such traction. Because it is not really about whether a few people were stopped at a gate. It is about what that gate represented in that moment. It represented the monarchy's oldest truth, that closeness, status, and affection do not always translate into effortless authority. It represented the fact that royal life still divides people into circles, permissions, and invisible gradations of importance. And it represented the tension at the heart of Camilla's position, a tension between public elevation and the lingering sense that acceptance is something she has had to earn over and over again. The monarchy may present itself as one united front. It often has to. But scenes like this remind people that unity inside royal life is usually managed, not magical. It is maintained through discipline, compromise, silence, and constant negotiation between family feeling and institutional logic. Most of the time, that negotiation stays hidden. Then something small goes wrong, and suddenly the hidden structure becomes visible. That is what happened here, at least symbolically. And maybe that is why the story lingers in people's minds, because it feels believable on a deeper level. Not just as gossip, but as a snapshot of how royal power really works when the cameras are not guiding the moment. It works through access, through control, through who gets waved through and who gets halted, through who has to ask twice and who never has to ask at all. So no, the real issue is not just that Camilla's private guests were blocked. The real issue is what that moment may have revealed about her place, her comfort, and the invisible hierarchy still operating around her. It hinted that titles can settle one question while leaving another quietly open. It suggested that even at the highest levels, belonging inside the monarchy is not always as simple as the public image makes it seem. And it reminded everyone that in this family, old sensitivities never disappear completely. They just wait for a moment like this to rise back to the surface. And that is why this may go quiet, but it will not feel forgotten. Because once a small royal incident starts exposing bigger truths about authority, legitimacy, and respect, it stops being forgettable. It becomes part of the atmosphere, part of the story people tell themselves about who is secure, who is tolerated, who is central, and who still has to feel for the edges of power even after standing beside the crown. So what do you think? Was this just a simple security mix-up that got blown out of proportion? Or did it reveal something much deeper about Camilla's standing inside the royal household and the monarchy itself? Let me know in the comments, because with this family, the quietest moments often say the most.